listening to Resist and Restore, a podcast from the Circle of Hope Pastors, where we're extending the table of our dialogue. I'm Jonny Rashid. I use he, him pronouns.
I'm Rachel Sensenegg, she, her.
Julie Hoke, she, her.
Ben White, he, him.
And we got quite a show for you. It's exciting. I love doing this. Beth Allison Barr is here. She wrote Making of Biblical Womanhood. Rachel and I get down with her, unpack the whole text. So it's a lush interview, and I'm excited to share that with you. We're going to end with what's been nourishing our soul, hoping that what's been blessing us can overflow and bless you as well. But I'm excited to say we got direct feedback last week when Ben interviewed me about the Bible from our friend Katie. So we're going to start with Talkback. Ben's got something to say about that.
Last week being 2 weeks ago, we release our podcast every fortnight. We love you.
Fortnight, good word.
So our friend Katie wrote us, and she attends a church that she's not so sure she should attend. And she's kind of on this pendulum swing, going back and forth. Should I be here? Should I not? And she gives us a whole list of the pros that why she should. But what she was responding to in Jonny and my conversation about the Bible from 2 weeks ago was she described as the relational versus orthodox church. It really helped give me clarity on why I even bother with this church. I missed that the Spirit of God could be so alive and active in us, and that view that the people of the church make the church rather than a top-down approach. And that's the distinction. I think people approach, Jonny was saying this, that the people approach the Bible as this kind of top-down thing. It's a rule book, do what you're told, and it's often used to oppress people, not even just like a moral rule book, but like a societal rule book to keep marginalized people in their place. This kind of top-down thing. And the way that Jonny redeems it personally and how we use it in Circle of Hope and how he encouraged everyone to approach the Bible is in this relational way. Come to the people in the Bible as if they're your friends. Let it into your heart. Get it below your head, so you're not just having some intellectual argument or some reorganization of power structures. Not just that, though it does do that. But start with this kind of relational thing, and that gave Katie a place to be in her church for right now. Even though it has a very, what she says, oppressive lens to the Bible, particularly for women in leadership. She calls it a patriarchal church. And she says, why am I attending a church that sees the Bible through an oppressive lens? I was down this road that I always go down. I need to change. But then when Sunday came and I had my family ready to go back to the liberal church, I remembered, I need to see Alicia to see how things with her exchange student are going. And I bet Randy will be there. And I really want to pray with her since it's the first week of school, etc. So she's got these real rich relationships, particularly with women in the church, that kind of give her a place to stand, even though the top she totally disagrees with.
Relationships are super powerful. They're how transformation happens. That's what we think in Circle of Hope. The best way to reveal Jesus is through relationships. We get to know one another by getting to know Jesus. Jesus reorders the whole world by coming into it as a baby and relating to us. And so relationships are at the heart of Christianity. But relationships also change our relationship to one another and to those we harm. I've had relationships with people that are harming others, and I've had to change those relationships and reduce intimacy in order to love somebody else that I'm relating to. And I think those are the kind of decisions that we need to make, because my relationships with Julie and Rachel, for example, and other women are why it's hard for me to attend a church like Katie's describing. So I'm with you in the pendulum because my relationships swing me one way and swing me in other ways. But it is through relationships that I've learned, this isn't just ideological. I'm not just coming up with a principle. I'm relating to people, and it's changing how I think about the church. And I'm imagining who else could be here and who wouldn't be safe because of my other relationships. And so the relational aspect changes it even changes my theology and my understanding of the Bible. And so my encouragement to those out there that are on the pendulum is keep relating. and, like Jesus, relate to the marginalized and the vulnerable and see if that doesn't change how you worship and how you connect.
My experience growing up was in a church that did not affirm women in leadership in the church. And it's resonating with me what you're saying, Jonny, because, I had deep, meaningful relationships in that church, family and people who became like family. But because of the environment and the theology because of the environment and the theology of the church, I never imagined myself in leadership in the church. I didn't have any space to even consider that. And it was because of connecting to Circle of Hope and the relationships in this community that people began to call me into the gifts that God has given me in new ways. So, yeah, I just want to name that I can relate to what Katie's saying in my own life, and I can see from where I am now how significant the relationships I had and have in Circle of Hope have changed me personally, and helped me live into I think, a more full version of myself. As I give the gifts that God has given me to build up the church.
Yes, Julie, I am resonating personally with what you're saying so much, because that's been my experience too. I didn't have like an ideological call to pastoring. I was in this environment of Circle of Hope where I was leading, and that was being affirmed through relationships and people saying, hey, you need to take yourself seriously. You're doing this among us, and the Holy Spirit. It was through the Holy Spirit affirming me personally, and through those relationships that this journey continues to come to fruition. So I just want to encourage Katie too, that it's, yes, the Spirit in the body through relationships does wondrous things, and we may not know the end of it.
Yeah. And to all the Katies out there that are working with it, we hope that Rachel and Julie are leading you to. Katie ends her thoughts with saying that she's finding peace with finding spiritual inspiration from multiple sources. And we're really privileged to be a part of your life, Katie. And again, all the Katies out there, that hopefully we can be a part of your spiritual inspiration, particularly Rachel and Julie. Consider them your pastors, because I know you guys love them, right?
Thanks, Ben.
Right back to us, y'all. Resist and Restore podcast at circleofhope.net. Talk back. It's the best thing.
Thanks again for listening to our show. We love having you as a part of our family. We want to keep extending the table of our dialogue. So like Ben just said, email us, resist and restore podcast at circleofhope.net, and keep connecting with us. Give this podcast a high review wherever you listen to it. So crank it all the way up to wherever it goes to, and then write something nice about us or give us some other kind of feedback if you wish. Further, subscribe to the podcast where you listen to it. These things help others connect to us, and so can you if you just share it with people who are looking for this kind of thing. We're looking for people who are looking for us, and if you know people like that, please share this podcast with them. Go to our website. You can connect with ourselves in our Sunday meetings, and also share in our common fund, which helps support the show and the church, and also changes our relationship to money as well, just in being generous. So go to circleofhope.church to find out how to connect to a cell, how to attend a Sunday meeting, and how to share in our common fund. Thanks so much for listening to us.
Dr. Barr, it's so wonderful to be here with you and my fellow pastor, Jonny Rashid. Thank you so much for being here on our show.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Would you start by introducing yourself To our listeners, tell us where you live, what you do for a living, how you're feeling today.
I would love to. I am Beth Allison Barr, and I do hope you will call me Beth on the show. And I'm a professor in Waco, Texas at Baylor University, which is one of the oldest Baptist universities, especially in Texas. And I am also a pastor's wife. So I've been in ministry for 24 years now with my husband. And I recently wrote a book called The Making of Biblical Womanhood, which was sort of my final, I tell people that it was sort of an act of desperation where I sort of was just, something has to change. And that is really why I wrote the book. In my day job, I am a professor. I teach medieval and women's history. This semester, I'm teaching a graduate seminar on women's theory and history. And so I was talking with students this morning who were in my class. And then I'm also an associate dean in the graduate school. So I'm over helping graduate students get jobs when they finish their degrees.
Wow, that's a lot. Thank you for making time for us here. All of our pastors read your book and really enjoyed it, The Making of Biblical Womanhood. And for me, it was really personally deeply affirming. It gave words and evidence to truths that in my felt experience after meeting Jesus, that the oppression of women was a political and economic, or is a political and economic and social construct, not a divinely ordained one. And that's the truly good news of the gospel that you are proclaiming.
Yes.
And I hope the worldwide church keeps waking up to this freedom in Christ. But culturally, as you said, we're not there yet. So I hope we can talk about this change here that we want to see. Even as a pastor, I've caught myself kind of needing to justify my calling from God in motherly and wifely terms.
Yes.
To make it safer and more palatable. And that's complicated because those are roles that I enjoy and I'm grateful for. So I appreciate how you're not seeking to take the goodness out of those relationships, but you are trying to shine light on this truth of the fullness of our humanity in Christ, and that God's Spirit has been poured out on all people. And it's time to return to that gospel truth and break down the barriers that keep women from knowing this truth about who we are and who God says we are.
Yes.
And even who the Bible writers, I think, were trying to reveal that we are, so that the fullness of God can be known. So I'm just so excited that you wrote this book, especially that you brought out medieval women have been such an encouragement to me in my journey, because I too felt like I'm missing all this history in the having grown up in the evangelical church, and they've been a lifesaver for me. So
I'm so glad.
Yeah. So Jonny, would you help us get into the book here with Dr. Barr?
Yeah, I'd love to do that. Thanks again, Beth, for being here. So cool to have you. You start your book by saying that you didn't intend to become an activist. So how does that change? How do you become an activist? How did the experience, especially of what your husband went through, how did that change your lived experience to become, hey, maybe I need to be an activist here?
Right. No, that's a very good question. And people who know me, people who grew up with me, know that this was a really big thing for me to do, because I'm a behind the scenes type of person. I like to help people behind the scenes. That's one of being a teacher. It's one of the things is we like to push our students forward and push them out the door to go do things and equip them to be able to do those things. So it's not in my nature to want to be the person on stage and to want to be the person who everyone is asking for interviews. But what happened in 2016, the culmination of so many things in my life, including the firing of my husband, including the election of Donald Trump, and I live in deep in the heart of Texas. So this was a very real, the reality of what the evangelical movement had become was in my face every day. And I had this breaking point where I realized that this isn't gospel, that this is not about Jesus, that this is about American culture, that this is about this hierarchy of oppression that is part of human history, but is not ordained by God. And I suddenly realized that, I've been teaching these women's history classes since 2008. And my students, every semester, my students would ask me the same question. They would say, Dr. Barr, why haven't we heard this before? Why haven't we heard this before? I mean, I got that question all the time from students. And it suddenly occurred to me, I was like, I know things that most of the church doesn't know. And if they knew these things, maybe it would get them to realize that calling women to be always under the authority and leadership of men is a human practice and not a godly practice. And so that's really what I realized, that to be an activist, I think, is just sort of realizing that you can do something to help people beyond yourself. This isn't just about me. In fact, it really isn't about me. If it was just about me, I would have kept my mouth shut because I would have never wanted to do the things that I'm doing now. But this realization that it is about more than you, and that by stepping forward, you can help other people. And in some ways, that's what the gospel is about. The gospel is about taking Jesus, showing what God has done for us, to those around us. And so in some ways, I think all Christians are called to be activists. We just don't do it. So that's a little bit helpful for you.
Oh, yes. That's beautiful. It's not just for ourselves. I think that is the heart of the gospel. Beth, you refuse to distinguish between patriarchy and Christian patriarchy. Why is that the case?
I like the way you asked that I refuse to distinguish. People keep asking me to back down on this. They keep saying, well, isn't this servant leadership, which is the term I'm really beginning to hate. I'm starting to have these very negative reactions to people who talk about servant leadership. And I'm like, but nonetheless, but they're like, well, isn't this beautiful? God created these two beautiful people and coming together, they have these different roles, and it just, it's this beautiful image. And I'm like, well, I guess it could be beautiful, except for it's not what God called us to do. This sort of saying that there is only one way to be a woman and only one way to be a man, and that in order to be called by God, you have to stay in that lane. That's not gospel at all. I mean, there's no, and I'm like, I guess you can make it look pretty, but it's not gospel. And patriarchy by, really, if you think Shakespeare, patriarchy by any other name, it's just patriarchy. And patriarchy says that there is something about women. There is something in women's bodies, the way women's bodies are made, that makes them unable to lead. And whether or not you say this is because women's bodies are inferior, whether this is because you say that women's bodies are created for different roles than men, however you define it, it's saying there is something about women that makes them unable to do what men can do. And some people reverse this and they say, well, men can't do things that women can do. And I'm like, well, yes, on the one hand, the way our bodies are created, there are things that both sexes can't do that the other one, I was like, that's not really a good argument. But when we think about cultural practice, everything a woman can do, a man can do. Now, a man is often demeaned for doing women's things, which also tells us something. But what patriarchy says is that there are some things that men cannot do that women should never do. Because there's something about them that makes them incapable. And that's an ontological argument. And people keep missing this. I mean, this is saying that God made us less than men. And that's the bottom line. So Christian patriarchy is arguing nothing more than what the classical Greek world argued, in which they said that women's bodies were inferior to male bodies. So I'm holding the line that patriarchy is patriarchy.
Yeah, I was fascinated that you quote Russell Moore, who explicitly defends patriarchy. And there's no other way about it. I mean, he says it. I mean, I'm not sure he would use that term now, but the meaning is still there.
Right.
And that is just a devastating reality.
Yeah, I wonder if Russell Moore would back off on that article now. I've heard him say, he said something recently where he said he really regretted some things he wrote early on in the 2000s. I'm wondering if one of them was this article.
I wonder about that too. You kind of got to some of the kind of Greek origins of Christian patriarchy. Where else do you think Christian patriarchy kind of got a foothold on the church?
Yeah, so I mean, patriarchy, it's funny because one of the arguments that complementarians make is they argue that the divine order of women being under the authority of men is sort of written into creation. And on the one hand, they sort of are right about this in the sense that it's written into human history. It is there from the very beginning. And it's not, I think this is one of the things too that made me really wake up when I was in graduate school. And I suddenly realized that the way that people in the ancient world were referencing women and treating women was very similar, because I was in graduate school at the same time that the Southern Baptist Convention was finalizing the Baptist Faith and Message of 2000. And so, this was a progression that actually started in the 80s was when it started. And then its final culmination was the product that we got in 2000. And so all this was going on literally down the street from me where I was in Chapel Hill. And it occurred to me that the things that they were arguing on the floor of the Southern Baptist Convention were the same things that I was seeing in ancient texts and in the worlds of, India and in Mesopotamia and everywhere. And so that was just that was a really hard fact to face, that we did not look any different from the rest of the world. And so what I think, if we look at Christian history, and if we even look at the Old Testament, and a lot of people have blamed Judaism for the patriarchy that seeps into the church, and this isn't accurate, right, either. Judaism also grew up in a patriarchal world. It evolved in a patriarchal world. So patriarchy influences Judaism the same way that patriarchy infiltrated Christianity. It's not Judaism's fault. It is this patriarchal world in which we live. So what we see, even in the Old Testament, is we see where there are all these patriarchal restrictions on women and all of these, things, the treatment of women. But yet at the same time, we still see this thread running through where God is always standing up. I mean, we think about Hagar. I love the story of Hagar, because Hagar, she's rejected. She faces the worst of patriarchy. And God finds her and says, I'm going to take care of you. And she names God.
That's right.
I mean, I don't know if people realize that, she's the first person to name God. And that appears in the Bible, that a woman names God. Mm-hmm. And she says, you're a God who sees. And I just see that thread. God always sees women. Mm. And throughout the whole Old Testament, New Testament, God always sees women and lifts them up. So you asked, where did patriarchy enter the church? I don't think Christianity has ever been separate from patriarchy, because Christians are human. Mm. And sin has never been separate from Christianity, because, this is the problem. So on the one hand, it is true that patriarchy is deeply embedded in the Christian tradition and in the Old Testament tradition, because this is who people are. At the same time, though, God has always pushed believers to not follow patriarchal practices, has always pushed believers to regard women as different than men. To regard women as human, just like men. Mm-hmm. So I think those two things both coexist. As for our modern church, if we talk about the patriarchy that we're most familiar with today in American Christianity, it is mostly a construct of the 19th century. that just kind of infiltrated back in, really through the evangelical movement that came from Britain to America. And so, evangelicalism, as much as there are things I like about evangelicalism, the focus on the Bible, the focus on Jesus, the reality is that evangelicalism has always been embedded in racism and patriarchy. And that's very construct. And so that's one of the reasons why it's so hard right now to separate it, because this has always been part of evangelicalism. So that was a broad answer that gave you a few specifics. Do you want me to unpack anything for you?
No, we're gonna get more into the modern evangelicalism in a bit. I want to see if we can go back to the early church, Beth, and you were starting to touch on how does Paul in particular, how do you think Paul reorders how we think of gender hierarchy? And I feel a personal excitement about this. My ethnic heritage is Italian, and so I'm very familiar with patriarchy in that culture, and that is the part of the world where a lot of these early churches got started. And even Paul's letter to the Romans, it's something new is happening there that Jesus started. So how does Paul reorder gender hierarchy?
Yes, no, this is, I've said this before. When I first decided to write this book, I didn't want to talk about Paul, because I feel like the arguments have gotten so, really ground to a halt in Paul, because it's come down to simply, well, I read it this way and I read it this way, and there's no middle ground. And I was just like, I'm done with that, because the problem is that neither side is really taking that full historical context into account. And when we look at it through history, it completely changes it. And so that ultimately is why I decided to include Paul. It was my husband that convinced me. He was like, you've got to show them how this changes Paul before they'll buy anything else you say. And so he convinced me of that. And what has happened is that I get almost daily, I get messages from women that include things like, you made me love Paul again. I always saw Paul as somebody I hated. I dreaded reading the epistles. I dreaded hearing sermons on Paul, something I heard all the time. And so I'm really thankful for that, because what I think Paul was doing, I don't think Paul was a feminist in the sense. I don't think he's actually advocating for women. I don't think that he is trying to, as I said, I don't think that he's intentionally trying to put women forward. I think what Paul is doing is trying to put the gospel forward. And I think what he sees is that Jesus transforms everything. And Paul grew, lived in this Roman culture. And in this Roman culture, women were regarded as property, as under the authority of men. And women were regarded, husbands literally had the power in life or death over the people in their household. Now, some used that authority. Most probably did not use that authority, but legally, that was their authority. And what Paul does, we just miss this so much as Christians, because we don't understand the first century church at all. And what we don't understand is that even the fact that women and slaves and children met together with the men in the room to all learn together, this was radical. Because this wasn't something, we're at the point, yes, sometimes women did go eat with men, and they would sit usually at separate tables, reclining tables, and then, but it was often either the wives or certain women that went and ate. This was a very segregated society in that sense, in that way. And yet here we have all of this house church, everyone's in the room, high-class citizens, low-class citizens, children, slaves, women. And so even just doing that is dramatically different. And then if we think about what Paul does in Ephesians, which is, the evangelical favorite, and it's actually been for a long time, keep women in their place passage. But even Paul starting off that passage, not only with submit to one another as to the Lord, but then he turns first to women. We just completely miss this. He doesn't, men are the head of the household. and they are the ones who are in charge. And usually you teach it to men and they filter it down to everybody else. And instead of doing that, he turns first to wives. And he says, look, wives, yes, we live in the Roman world. You are to submit to your husbands. That's the law of the land. But you don't do it for the reason in this context. You do it to the Lord. You submit to the Lord. And husbands are also called to submit to wives, because this in the Lord, this is what we do. We submit to each other. And husbands, instead of having authority of life and death over your wives, you are supposed to give up your lives for your wives. And I mean, it completely transforms that. And it is so ironic that we use this passage to enforce female subordination. When the whole point is that Jesus, the world of Jesus, turns our cultural understandings upside down and says all people, are equal here. So if that's a little bit, I mean, I think Paul just understanding that context that Paul is in and what he's trying to do, which is the gospel goes forward, and Jesus uses everyone to put the gospel forward. It is not limited by gender. And so we're not going to limit it by gender here either.
Really love that explanation, Beth. Thank you for that. If I'm reading you correctly, you say that there are times in the New Testament where it seems like Paul is reiterating Aristotle's understanding of gender or a Roman understanding. But you say we shouldn't be reading Paul in that light, in that, in fact, preceding his iteration of the rule, he seems to contradict it, almost mocking the hierarchy. Can you say more about that?
Yes. So this is a strategy. As we know, Paul's a learned person. He is trained in Roman rhetorical strategies, this classical rhetorical strategies, which means how to speak and how to make a persuasive argument. And if Paul's anything, he's persuasive. He also speaks in a very different tone than other people that we read in the Bible, other authors of the text. We can tell the Pauline tone or the people who are also in, working with Paul. And one of the mistakes we make too is we think about these texts as being single author, because that's what we think about today. But really, there are communities, collaborative. There's a lot of collaborative work going on here. We get images of this because Paul tells us he's not writing a lot of this stuff. He's talking with other people and then producing it that way. So we have to just rethink about how the Bible was created and how we got to it. And one of the practices that we find is that the Bible often uses the rhetorical strategies of the world in which those people are living. We can think about Genesis and the poetry that it is. I mean, it's a rhetorical strategy that is used to help people understand something that's incomprehensible and to understand how they are set apart from the people around them. And so it's a rhetorical strategy. Paul uses the same type of rhetorical strategies. And one of the ones that Roman orators were trained in was what is often called the quotation strategy, or that's a simplified version of it. But essentially where they take the arguments that they want to refute and they state it. And then they refute it. Now, Jesus does this too. He said, you have heard, but I'm going to tell you this.
Yeah.
So Paul sets up this method. He says, this is what's going on. But is that what we're really supposed to do? He uses these quotations and to talk about, he said, food is good for the body and the body for food. But then he goes on, but is this what is taking the Eucharist, communion? Is it all about the food and body? No, this is a symbolic. I mean, well, I'm Baptist,
You're Baptist.
But it is a spiritually significant, however you want to do it. It is, and of course, it becomes our first sacrament. But all Christians, no matter how low church you are, we regard this as a sacrament. It's coming together for the meal. So Paul uses this strategy, and he does this in Romans in 14. 1 Corinthians 14, in which he is talking about. He's talking about order and worship. I mean, I just can't see this passage any other way. I know that there are some biblical scholars who are still like, we just think those words were inserted. And I'm like, well, that's fine too, because what we know is that these aren't Paul's words. They are the Roman context. But I also see, the passage flows really easily when you understand that what Paul is doing. He's talking about order and worship, how we're all supposed to be order and worship. And then he says, and, women are to be silent in worship. They're not ever supposed to talk. And then after that, he says, what?
Yep.
Did the word of God originate with you? He's like, yes, of course women can talk in worship. That's not at all what I'm saying. Everybody needs to be trained. Everybody needs to, to have some sort of idea of what's going on. There's an order to this all. But of course women can speak in church. And this is even more apparent when we look at those words, women be silent, ask your husbands at home. And they are almost word for word from Greco-Roman sources.
Wow.
This is something that we know was out there. And Lucy Pepia just does a beautiful job with this in her Women in Corinth, where she says, it is so clear that Paul is refuting practices that the Corinthian men are bringing into the church. And Paul is walking through them one by one and saying, in the world of Jesus, we don't do this. And so anyway, yes.
Beth, I wept when I first read it like that. Like, what? Did the word of God originate with you? I feel like I can hear Paul saying that.
Yes. Yeah, we do. And we can also, we know that Phoebe read Romans. And I wonder if there were other, surely there were other female voices who read these texts to audiences. And you just think about a woman reading that text out. I mean, anyway.
Yeah. Let's jump to medieval times.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could tell us about Marjorie Kemp and why she's important to our story.
So I've been writing on Marjorie Kemp since I was an undergraduate. In fact, the paper that I wrote that got me into graduate school was a comparison of Marjorie Kemp and Julian of Norwich, who is another 15th century mystic. They're very different people, but they are also doing very similar things, although in different ways. And who Marjorie Kemp is, she's actually really a pretty ordinary woman. She's a little wealthier than other people around. Her father's the mayor of a town in the eastern part of England, East Anglia. It's King's Lynn. It was called Bishop's Lynn or Lynn at the time. But anyway, you can still go there today and go wander around King's Lynn. It's a lovely place. But Marjorie Kemp was born there in the aftermath of the plague, which was the middle of the 14th century. So she's born later in 1373, I think. And she has a pretty ordinary life. She gets married to somebody who she considers to be beneath her, which is kind of an interesting part of the story, because she always has this, she considers that her husband is kind of underneath her. She also hangs on to all of her own wealth. Marjorie controls the pocketbook in the family, which a lot of my students are always like, what? Women were in charge of the money? And it's like, yeah, actually, they could. She also is a businesswoman. She tries to do some businesses, and she tells us that she tries to do these things because she wants to wear fancy clothes to church, and her husband is always against her starting these businesses, but she doesn't really care what he thinks. She does them anyway, and she fails. She talks about this. She's also the mother of 14 children, which actually play very little role in her text. We only really see her talk about 2 of her children. One of them is the child at the very beginning that she gives birth to that leads her to what seems to be a pretty severe postpartum depression. And then the other one is her son, who, essentially she tells us that he lives a life of sin and dies, and he deserved it. She kind of tells us that at the end. She was like, he brought this on himself. So she's, if we think about constructions of motherhood, Marjorie is great. But what Marjorie Kemp, the reason that I love her so much, I always reiterate to my students, I don't think I would really want to be Marjorie Kemp's friend. She is, she's very dramatic, and I imagine that being her friend would, she doesn't have very many friends, and it's easy to understand why, because I think she's a difficult person to be around. But at the same time, Marjorie Kemp is an ordinary woman who feels called by God. And part of the reasons that she has to be so dramatic is because she lives in a world where it is hard for an ordinary woman who feels called by God to live out that calling. And so Marjorie Kemp's book is a story of an ordinary woman trying to live out her calling to God in whatever way that she can. And the strategies that she uses are pretty brilliant. And one of the things, that scholars have talked about a lot, on the one hand, we see Marjorie Kemp resisting what it is a woman is supposed to be. In fact, one of the places where she's arrested, there are women and men in the crowd yell at her. They say, "Why don't you go home and fix your husband's trousers?" And, things like that, and telling her that she needs to go back to her place. And then, but Marjorie, never does this. And in fact, what she continues doing is she essentially is a street preacher. She preaches everywhere. And when she gets called on this practice, she says, "Oh, no. I'm not a priest. I'm not trying to get ordained. I'm just trying to tell people the good news." And so they're like, "Oh, well, you're right. You're not trying to be ordained. You're not trying to go into a pulpit. So we can't do anything to you." I mean, so she's really brilliant, and she works this patriarchal structure where she manages to stay underneath. And in fact, one of my favorite parts in the book that I didn't put in my book, and I kind of wish I had now, but there's this conversation that Marjorie has with St. Paul, where Marjorie's so upset after she's been arrested and been accused, of being a heretic because she's a street preacher. And Jesus says, "Marjorie, I'm going to send you somebody to tell you he's sorry." And St. Paul comes to Marjorie in this vision and says, "I'm really sorry that my words have caused you this much problem." And he says, "This is going to give you a special place in heaven because you have persevered." I mean, it's this amazing little excerpt thing. And he doesn't apologize for saying the words. He apologizes for the harm. So what this means is that she's still not a heretic, because she's not saying don't, fall, to throw Paul out the window, or that God has given her a new interpretation of Paul. What she's saying is that Paul understands the challenges his words have created for women who feel called to serve, and that he's going to make sure they get a special place in heaven because of the problem. And so this is brilliant. So, she conforms to patriarchy while at the same time resisting it. And in doing so, she lives out her calling. And that's why I think she's important to this story, because she shows us how women have always felt called beyond what the patriarchal limits of the church allow them. And they don't feel like this is calling them. And they also feel like maybe scripture has not been interpreted the way that it should, because it contradicts the way God calls women.
Yes.
And so we even see this with Marjorie Kemp, even this, late 14th, she dies in the 15th century. Last words we hear from her in the 1430s. Anyway, but we see this woman who knows what women are being taught, but also feels like there's more to the story. So.
Yes,
that helps a little.
you. Thank you. I real quick.
Yeah.
Tell us how she hangs on to herself and speaks back to the Archbishop
of York
when he calls her a wicked woman.
Yeah, no, this is a lovely story. And it's really quite amazing too, because it shows us how clever Marjorie is. Because this is a time when there's a heresy in England called Lollardy. It stems from John Wycliffe. There's a lot of nuance to this, but essentially, one of the problems is one of the things John Wycliffe really got in trouble for is saying that the clergy should not have this special position, that they weren't really any more special than anyone else, especially in regards to the property that had been given to the church. I mean, if you there's an economic thing going on behind John Wycliffe here, where he's saying, essentially they don't deserve this property that they have and how much wealth they have. And one of the things that Wycliffe followers also did is they started producing a vernacular translation of the Bible. Now, it's not the only vernacular translation of the Bible out there. There's actually other vernacular translations. But this one, becomes very, very famous and begins to be used by a whole lot of people. So Marjorie Kemp, by preaching scripture, it is making her, and by resisting clerical authority, Marjorie is often identified as a lawlord, as a heretic. So she, this is the problem with her. And one of these times that she's arrested, she's brought before the Archbishop of York. And in the English ecclesiastical structure, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Archbishop of York are the two most important ecclesiastical figures who report essentially straight to Rome. So very, very important person. Archbishop of Canterbury is a lot more important than the Archbishop of York, but nonetheless. So she gets called before the court of the Archbishop of York. And I mean, the dialogue between them is amazing, because he says, "You are a wicked woman. I hear all these things that you're doing." And she looks at him and she says, "No, I'm not a wicked woman, but I hear you're a wicked man. And if you don't repent, then it's going to be bad for your soul." I mean, this is an amazing thing. The reason she gets away with it is because she has a reputation of a holy woman, as this woman religious, and because she's not actually doing anything heretical. Mm-hmm. And so the Archbishop of York just doesn't really know what to do with her. And, and part of it, she does have these political, her father is the mayor of King's Lynn. So we know that she does have some ties that probably help her out a little bit. But at the end of the day, what happens is the Archbishop of York essentially says, "You can go keep doing what you're doing." I mean, he tells her not to preach. She says, "I'm not preaching." He says, "Well, stop talking about God on the streets. Don't do it in my diocese." And she says, "No, God told me to do this and I'm going to keep doing it." And then his next response is, "Somebody please come take this woman away from me." And he pays a guy to take Marjorie Kemp away from him. And then she goes and rejoices with her friends. They have a party because God rescued her from this man who she resisted in every instant. Everything he told her to do, she said no. Mm-hmm. And she gets, so I mean, it's this amazing story that a lot of people, if nothing else, I hope the Making of Biblical Woman has brought Marjorie Kemp back into church history.
Yes, thank you.
Some evangelicals have an image of Mary and Martha that seems to differ pretty greatly from the medieval one. So what happens to Mary and Martha? Who were they? How are they known in medieval times? And then what happened to them?
Yes, this is one of the things that really has been lost with evangelicals, because a lot of the evangelical movement in the 19th century has a significant anti-Catholic strain. And this is, anything that even seemed Catholic to many folk was completely rejected. And this included a lot of the church traditions and stories about women. And what we find is that in early Christianity, there are very powerful stories about women that were told for 1,000 years to women and men in the church. And they would hear these stories. I mean, we can even think about, the story of Mary and Martha today, Mary and Martha of Bethany, the sisters of Bethany. And the way the story is told for us today is that they are the housekeepers for Jesus, that Jesus and his disciples sort of come and crash at their house when they need good food and they need to be taken care of. They need somebody to do their laundry. And this is what Mary and Martha do for them. And the reason that the reason Mary is scolded by Martha is because she's not helping Martha do all of these domestic tasks. And that's sort of the version we think, and this version is used to reinforce why women are called to the home. I mean, that's the way that it's used. Well, let's think about in the medieval world, if women are hearing these stories similar to that, like Mary and Martha, except for instead of them being these domestic goddesses, Martha is a preaching dragon slayer. And, what's the impact that has? I mean, what it tells women is, even if maybe they're not going to be dragon slayers, that women were preaching. And women were acknowledged as preachers, and women were acknowledged as having this role in the early church and became saints in the same way as men. And both Mary and Martha actually were in the medieval world. Mary of Bethany is conflated with Mary Magdalene, which there's a whole history about that. But Mary and Martha were both dragon slaying preachers.
Wow.
And I mean, this is just something. It's so far removed
we totally
from
miss
our
it.
Domesticated Mary and Martha. And people are like, well, that's not true. They weren't dragon slayers. And I'm like, it doesn't matter. I was like, it's not true either that they are domestic hostesses.
Right.
Both of those are wrong. What matters is how women hear them and the impact and what it tries to tell us. And in the medieval world, women heard stories that women preached. In the modern world, we hear stories that women served food.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh, so great. Let's move into the Reformation. How did the Reformation change how we see women and almost kind of invent what we know as biblical womanhood?
I'll try to make this really fast. You know, the Reformation chapter was my second hardest chapter to write because as a historian, it is a very complicated thing that's going on with women during this time period. And a whole lot of it actually doesn't have to do with Reformation theology. It's Reformation theology got caught up in a world that was beginning to limit women even more. Mm-hmm. And so, and it's not that women in the medieval world were freer. It's just that the limits on them were different. So this is something, you know, it's not that patriarchy doesn't exist for women. It's just that it changes. And in the early modern world, one of the ways that it was changing was that the most important role for women was the role of wife. And in fact, the only really recognized legitimate identity for women, legally, socially, religiously, was the role of wife. And this gets tied up with Reformation theology, that women are spiritually equal to men, but women's highest spiritual calling is to be a wife, which legally means that they're always under the authority of men. Mm-hmm. And so what we see happening in the Reformation is we see this emphasis on the godly role of a woman is to be a wife, which legally, economically, socially means that she's always subordinate to men. And it is this narrative, this marriage, if I can use that, this marriage of a woman's role in the culture, this emphasis on her role as wife, married Reformation theology that this is the godliest thing for a woman to do. And what we end up with is that to be a godly woman is to be under the authority of a husband. And this also explains why Paul gets a revival in the sense of what Phyllis Tribble has called the texts of terror, which are those 5 or 6 passages that talk about women being submissive and subordinate. And those suddenly spike. You know, if there was a Google Analytics tool for early modern sermons, what we would see is this straight up spike of those types of passages being used for women in sermons, as well as women being separated out in sermons to be treated differently. And in the medieval world, we don't get that. We don't get women. I mean, sometimes we do, but it's very specific sermons, and it's interesting how it's done. It's not done in the same way. So if that's in a nutshell, that's what happened.
Yeah, one of the starkest pictures of that to me is women sitting together in the church meeting in medieval times, kind of having this sisterhood, this culture of support for one another. And then post-Reformation, they're sitting next to their husbands under that authority.
Yes. And, you know, for your listeners that want to know more about this, Catherine French has written some really, her book on the good women of the parish just really drives this point home. And I quoted her concluding paragraph in the book, you know, that she really shows this stark picture of, yes, there were women, the role of wife really was elevated. You know, many women did agree more with Reformation theology, but at the same time, women lost this parish community. They lost these support structures of other women. And the impact of this is something that we cannot neglect.
Mm-hmm.
So this was something I found interesting. The TNIV uses gender inclusive language, and the ESV effectively writes women out of the Bible. But this is a recent phenomenon relative to like medieval churches and even earlier than that, when they were translating the Bible in a gender inclusive way. So can you speak to why gender inclusive language in the Bible isn't a result of postmodernism?
Yeah, no, this is, in fact, if you think about the beginning of my academic journey that brought me to the Making of Biblical Womanhood, it starts with gender inclusive language. Because one of the very first papers, in fact, the second paper that I ever gave at an academic conference was on gender inclusive language in medieval sermon Bible translations. And it was at the same time that the debate was going over the TNIV, that the World magazine was publicizing, had all of those articles where it's talking about, feminism infiltrating the church through this gender inclusive Bible. And it was just so funny to me because what I had been reading are 15th century sermons where priests routinely used gender inclusive language and inserted it into biblical passages. They have the Latin, and then they translate it for their audience. And when they would translate it, they would use gender inclusive texts. They would translate it gender inclusively, instead of, anyway, all sorts of examples that I can give you. In fact, it's really hard to read a 15th century English sermon and not come across an example of this. I've tried it, and I just keep finding them. So this was a very common practice in the medieval world, which means that it's not a product of feminism. Now, feminism in the 1960s did make us more aware of the impact of language that excludes women. And this is a practice that really goes back to the 17th century. We can trace the evolution of the English language, and it begins to become more androcentric, where English is a really bad language for inclusivity. It just is. And there's not a really good word, the word man began to be used as the word human. And while on the one hand, the word man is supposed to be inclusive and supposed to be talking to both men and women, a lot of scholars have analyzed the way the word man is used, and it's mostly not. It mostly actually is referencing only men. And that's one of the reasons why then they have to put in separate subsects that say, and then when we talk about women, we have to do this because men is supposed to include women, but it doesn't really. Women are always othered. So we see this emphasis though, but men are writing texts, texts are written by men for men about men. This is what happens with early modern English. And this influences the translation of early modern English Bibles. We see this, this androcentric perspective that begins to infiltrate. And it really picks up in the 19th century at the time when laws against women are really hardening, where when women get married, they lose their property to their husband. They no longer have any control over their property or their wealth. And so it's not surprising at all that women are completely shut out of language at this point. And it's also no surprise that this is when the first suffrage movement begins, because women are so shut out that they realize the laws are going to have to change in order for them to begin to have a voice. And this hardening of language is a part of this in the 19th century. And what we ended up with are Bibles that are written to men instead of considering women as well. And the feminism in the 1960s helped wake us up a little bit to this. There was a lot of studies on what happens to little girls when they hear sermons that talk only about men. What happens is they don't listen, because they don't hear themselves in the stories. What happens when all the stories are about men? Little girls don't listen because they're not hearing themselves in the stories. And so feminism helped wake us up to this. And so while there is sort of, we were woken up to the impact of gender inclusive language, but the use of gender inclusive language is not a product of feminism, nor is it really an addition or a change to biblical text, because Greek was much better at being gender inclusive than English is. And so it's mostly actually just correctly translating passages that include both women and men and re-putting that back in the Bible where English, the androcentric emphasis of the English took it out.
So when the ESV is translated in it and they exclude women again, would you say they are then adding something to the text? They're adding something that wasn't there?
Totally. They are. And now every Bible translation does this to a certain extent. Most Bible translations today, most English Bible translations are 95% the same. The things that change are the things that really emphasize the priorities of the translators. And so this is true of every translation. So on the one hand, I don't know if the ESV is doing anything terribly different than everyone else. The problem is that the reason the ESV is doing it is to exclude women. and to emphasize complementarianism as being the divine order. So they're rewriting biblical text to make it look like they're right. And they're intentionally doing it. That's also the other thing, is that they actually say that the ESV is unapologetically complementarian.
Yeah.
And so those are the things that really raise red flags, is their, not only their perspective, but the intentionality of their perspective, with the goal of pushing women out of ministry and pushing women into the home under the authority of their husbands.
Mm-hmm. Beth, you talk about how this construct of biblical womanhood is kind of built up by the cult of domesticity.
Yeah.
How did the Industrial Revolution kind of invent the cult of domesticity?
Oh, this is another. I'm a social historian, which means that I'm very interested in ordinary people, as well as how economic structures influence the lives of ordinary people. And the Americans don't like to hear this, because we're all about, we have our own agency. Our stories about, we pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. But some people have longer bootstraps than other people. And some people just can't pull themselves up as high, not because they're not trying, but because of structures that are limiting them. Okay. And so what happened with the Industrial Revolution is that it began to separate work, paid work, from women's work. And this is a huge marker. It's really, women don't really change what they're doing. It's just that women usually don't receive recognition for what they're doing. And this with the industrial, and so in the medieval world, women actually did have, I don't want to say economic freedom, but they were able to run their own businesses. There was work that was paid work that was characterized as specifically female. And a lot of this work was like, brewing, making beer, doing food, all of those sort of things. They were still lower paid, lower wages. But with the Industrial Revolution, what happened is that a lot of those types of services moved outside the home. And women as factories were built, and suddenly the Industrial Revolution creates a problem we haven't had before, and that's childcare. Because when everyone's kind of working around the home and in the home, childcare is not really a problem. When you have multi-generational families in a home, childcare is not as much of an issue. But when you move school and you move work outside the home, then it sort of becomes like logistically like, well, how do I get my kids there where they're supposed to be? How do I go work and leave kids at home or not? I mean, it suddenly logistically creates these challenges. And so historically, it is so fascinating that at the same time that these logistical challenges are created, that we begin to see narratives that emphasize that women's job really isn't in the workplace anyway. Women's job is really in the home, because somebody needs to take care of those kids. And then all of these narratives come that it's actually better for women because women's bodies aren't able to do these things. And it's really hard. And it was hard on them to be on their feet 15 hours a day in a factory when they were pregnant. But the reason women had to do that is because, first of all, there was no protection for them. If they wanted to keep their job, they had to keep their job that way. And also because there was it became a spoken thing that women don't deserve to get paid as much as men, because women are intellectually inferior to men. Women can't do the work of men. So therefore we pay them lower. And not only do we pay them lower, but and I emphasize this, I actually quote, I can't remember his name, I'll quote one of the guys in this book who says this, but essentially, if we pay them less, it will encourage them to not work outside the home. And so what we see is, and this is part of what the cult of domesticity is, that a woman's place is in the home and family. And those are her priorities. And those are the priorities not only created for her by culture, but also ordained by God.
Yeah, this is where I feel like the plight of the modern woman really comes in, and we have to be and do everything, and I just see how that came in the Industrial Revolution, where they no longer own the means of production, but yet they're expected to be this goddess at home.
Yeah,
you can't win.
No, you cannot win. And we see where it got us, how it got us today. I mean, the separation of work and creating, like people today talk about how hard it is for a woman to work outside the home. And I'm like, well, yeah, that's because the structures of our businesses today are built for men. And they are built for men who don't take into account family. And so the reason that it's hard for women to work is because we have built a workplace that excludes women.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things of COVID is I think it has really brought this to the forefront, that women can be very effective workers with different, from different environments and doing different, that we need to accommodate. And we need to take family into account when we think about work.
Absolutely. So the Industrial Revolution shaped how we understood biblical womanhood, but this was really surprising to me, and I think you too. That Arianism, this heresy that the Father created the Son and isn't co-substantial with him, and inerrancy as well. The idea that the Bible isn't without any errors. Both of these ideas sort of cemented biblical womanhood as a concept. So heresy, and then a specific campaign to read the Bible in a new way.
Exactly.
Can you speak to that, unpack that for us so that we can see these kind of outside influences changing how we see women specifically?
Some people have asked me, they're like, well, where do you get the most pushback in the text? And I'm like, I don't know. That's a hard question, because I get pushback in all sorts of areas from the text. It depends on who's pushing back. But one of the places that I have gotten pretty consistent pushback is my discussion of Arianism and my characterization of what we call the eternal subordination of the Son as heresy. And so it's really fascinating. The people who criticize this are people who are in those groups that most support it. So, that also tells you something. But what we see happening in the 20th century is, if we think about the culmination of this time where women, the lines have been drawn that make it really hard for women to be in workspaces and women to get education unless they give up family and marriage. And so this is why we end up with all these single school teachers and everything, because that's if they want to do this, that's the path to do it. So we have these hard gender lines that are drawn. We also have people accepting that these gender lines come from the Bible, that this is, that a woman's place is the home and a woman's place is marriage and family. So people are accepting that. We also have in the late 19th century really coming with Darwin, and, Darwin sort of just totally shook up the evangelical world because it made them rethink maybe creation. And a lot of people reacted very strongly to that. There were a lot of scholars who kind of took it a little bit too far, this influence from some folk in Germany. And essentially they were like, oh, well, let's, it's sort of like, I'm minimizing this. They were very good scholars, but I think about it like with graduate students, when you introduce them to the concept of deconstruction, and suddenly they're like deconstructing everything,
Sure.
Like nothing has meaning anymore. Nothing is, concrete. So we kind of see that happening with the Bible. It's like, no, all of this was made up. Nothing has any meaning. It's only people trying to create meaning for themselves. And so a lot of Christians begin to push back on that, rightfully so. But some Christians begin to push back so hard that they begin to argue almost exactly the opposite, that the Bible in every form is literally true. And this pushback came without really taking historical context into account, without even really taking the Bible translation history into account. It said the Bible you have in front of you is literally every true. Inerrancy. Inerrancy is not about believing the Bible. Inerrancy is about believing a very literal interpretation of the Bible that was propagated by a group of men coming out of Princeton Theological Seminary in the early 20th century. That's what inerrancy is. And inerrancy had begun to become equated, though, with if you believe the Bible, you are an inerrantist. And people who don't believe the Bible, well, people who aren't inerrantists, they don't believe the Bible. Which is why I get, people ask me, they're like, are you an inerrantist? And I'm like, that's the wrong question.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not going to answer that question because it is going to make you think something that isn't actually what that word means. What that word means is, do I believe a particular translation, a particular understanding of the Bible that came out of this political context, this religious sort of infighting in the early 20th century? The same thing with Arianism. Arianism is a very old heresy in the church. Arianism also can really have two meanings. It can be a very specific meaning, which talks about what happened with the Council of Nicaea with Arius, priest who said, there was a time when the sun was not. That was his jingle. I always talk about with students that, he had the first sort of, Kellogg's cereal jingle. There was a time when the sun was not, that Jesus was a created being. And the Council of Nicaea says, no, that undermines everything about Christianity. It undermines everything that we've been taught. In order for salvation to work, Jesus is God. Jesus is always God. That's what we've always been taught. So they condemn Arianism as heretical. Well, throughout history, Arianism, it's a very attractive idea to humans. We always try to make God in our own image. Arianism makes God in our own image. And so we have different variations of it throughout time. Sometimes it is that Jesus is a created being. We can think about other sort of offshoots of Christianity where this is taught, that Jesus is a created being. That's all under the umbrella of Arianism. We can also have times where people say, well, Jesus is God, but he's different than God the Father. They aren't their essence yet. They try to get real clever with how the division of it is. But essentially what they argue is that Jesus is a different God than God the Father. They have different roles.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what happened in the 20th century, is people who supported the women and men are created with gender roles that are separate but equal, which also should have other warning flags to us, that women are created with separate but equal roles, that the reason that we know this is divinely ordained is because it reflects the roles of God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, that they are equal but have separate roles. The problem is that this is saying that Jesus is not the same substance as God the Father. And so it is big blanket Arianism, heresy that has always been condemned because it says that Jesus is not the same as God the Father, which is what the Council of Nicaea condemned and said anyone who believes this should be, essentially should be anathemized. They should be thrown out of the church because this isn't Christian.
Wow.
So
there was such a commitment to patriarchy that they would even commit a heresy in order to do it.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
And then completely shift how they even understand the Bible too. Old Princeton, that kind of made inerrancy a thing, is now Westminster, which isn't far from Philadelphia. So we still have that sort of influence right now. Like that's still a thing there right now in that school, inerrancy.
It shifted out of Princeton, which became a very different animal.
Totally.
Later on. But inerrancy just won't go away because people don't understand and they think they're asking, do you believe in the Bible? And what they're really asking is, do you believe this particular interpretation of the Bible that developed from this particular context in the early 20th century?
Absolutely. We just have a few more questions, but where do you see this movement going next? How long will it be before complementarianism is extinct? Is that something we can hope for?
Yeah. So I have two answers for that. On the first answer, I have a lot of hope. What I see happening is, I don't know if that hope's going to be realized within the next 10, 15, 20 years, but what I see happening is I see women and men in complementarian spaces beginning to wake up. And they're often not sure what they're going to do with this yet, but they realize that what they have been taught may not be a part of the gospel. And they're beginning to realize the implications of these teachings about women and how women internalize these teachings. And that's what, even people in soft complementarian churches, I think what they need to understand is that their daughters are hearing things that say there's something about them that makes them less than men. And they need to think about how women internalize that. And so, it can be very dangerous. So I think people are starting to wake up. And so what I think we're going to see happening is in these churches where people are waking up, either they're going to start leaving, which I don't really know if most people will leave because there's so many reasons that you stay in these types of movements. But what I think you're going to start seeing is people not putting up with the status quo anymore. And so we're going to see, so that's what I think. I think we're at a breaking point.
So the churches could change even.
Yeah, I think there may be some changes. Now, I don't know. My husband says it's just easier to start a new church than to change a church culture. He is probably right about that. I think there may be some shifting where some of these really hardcore churches are going to start getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and people, are going to branch off from them with a broader understanding of what women and men can do in the church. So I think we're going to see an inward awakening, and we already are, that is going to start having an impact on our churches. I'm not exactly sure what effect that's going to take. So that's my hope, and that's what I see, and I'm so encouraged by that. As a historian, though, patriarchy is part of history.
Mm-hmm.
We have been trying to get rid of this thing. Every century, people are trying to get rid of this thing, just like we keep trying to get rid of racism.
Yeah.
The problem is that they are so much part of human DNA that we define ourselves by how we are better than someone else.
Mm-hmm.
And hierarchy, that's the way we define ourselves. So is it ever going to go away? I don't think it is. But I think the Christian church needs to, if we're going to make a difference in the world, we need to make a difference in this area.
Yeah.
And so I'm hoping that instead of being the voice of opposition, the church needs to be pushing towards, this idea of the image of God.
Absolutely.
We are all created in the image
Absolutely.
of God. So there's my thoughts.
Amen. So where can we find you, Beth, in that? What are you working on next? And this is our final question.
So I am, I didn't really know if I ever wanted to do anything like this again. That was honestly, my honest thought was I'm going to drop this and then run back to academia where, and have 100 people read my next book. That was my initial thought. But again, I still have that same thing that drove me to write The Making of Biblical Womanhood. It's that there is scholarship that academics know that could change the church for the better. And so I have started working on a project that follows some of these same lines as what you saw. It's not really a follow-up to The Making of Biblical Womanhood. It's sort of an expansion of this idea of what, by reminding the modern church about our medieval past, how it can help us for the better. And so that's what I've sort of began working on. It's going to pick up women, but it's not going to only pick up women.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Oh, that's so great. Okay, we're part of that with you. Our Circle of Hope. We're always talking about the medieval church characters that inspire us. Many of them women.
Oh yeah.
So thank you, Beth, and we'll be on the lookout for your next book. And just in closing, the scripture that keeps coming to mind is about, not conforming to the pattern of this world, but being transformed by the renewing of our minds. So thank you for inspiring us not to just kind of swallow what the world has given us and even what the church has conformed to, but to actually look to Jesus for the understanding of who we are. Thanks.
That's so great. Yeah, and I'm very glad. I know, people keep reminding me, they're like, Beth, you wrote this book for men too. And I'm like, I'm so glad men are reading it. But if you really get down to me, honestly, I wrote this book for women. Awesome. I wrote it for women who feel called by God, to let them know that they are called by God.
Excellent.
And so I'm really glad, Rachel, that you have been, freed by it, because in some ways you are my target audience.
Wonderful. I am honored and grateful. Thank you.
This last segment is where we share what has been nourishing our souls. Spiritual show and tell. We want to give the gifts that we have received from God and share them freely. We hope that it nourishes you too. So, pastors, what has been nourishing you this past week?
My wife, for our anniversary in July, got me a subscription to Poetry magazine from the Poetry Foundation. This is an actual poetry magazine. You might be able to hear it on my microphone. I'm flipping the pages.
Ooh, it's colorful.
Yeah, the art's pretty cool too. And there's art inside as well. I want to read you a poem from Fritz Ward that is in the September edition. It's called Love Letter from Inside Fatherhood. Inside the trap, I spend weeks remodeling the haven you'll haunt. Not for the joy of it, but for the wonder that keeps snapping my neck. Come December, there's a morning when the sun slathers the bare trees in saffron, and I hold you more delicately than I've ever held myself. See how we've risen before the moon has fallen? See how we've nested and itched? The boringness of it all has infected us with wonder, with want, with why. And yet all of it, the blood vocabulary, the fibroid angel, the cries echoing from birth and back, all of it just beyond our understanding, our standing. But the truth I don't want to tell you is that you matter more, then less, then more. And all of this is breakable and already broken.
Oh my gosh. Can you please send that to me?
Yeah, and I'll put it in the show notes. It's linked on the Poetry Foundation website.
What a good gift your wife gave you. Thanks, Ben.
My pleasure.
What else?
My cellmates around temple last night were reminding me of the wisdom of Sabbath in our exploration of the scripture. We were looking at Hebrews 4, and it's talking about like God calling people into rest that is for today. And we were all admitting how difficult it is to actually take a Sabbath. And this is an idea in the Bible about like an intentional time, that's kind of setting aside an intentional time every week to like not work or produce, but to just kind of receive the goodness of your life. And we were sharing how difficult that is to actually stop doing stuff. You know, they're busy college students. I'm a pastor. And I was realizing how I gave up my normal Sabbath rhythm this past Saturday because I was preparing for our first morning Sunday meeting, which I enjoyed so much. It was wonderful, but I was tired in a different way afterward. And I realized as I was sitting there with them in community in this discussion that, oh, it's probably related to like not doing my Sabbath rhythm, that tiredness I felt afterwards. So I'm newly inspired to like actually try and maintain those boundaries in my life so that I can rest in a fuller way.
I'm with Ben on the poetry line this week because
You've waited so long.
October 4th, St. Francis Day just happened on Monday, and on Sunday we celebrated it at the Sunday meeting. And for the first time in my life, in honor of this special day, we changed some things up at the Sunday meeting, and I gave a talk using a psalm only for the first time in 11 years. So that's the first time it's ever happened.
Wow.
That was the only Bible reference. And I only got into like Babylonian captivity once in the talk. So it was really great. But I was reading Robert Alter's beautiful translation of the Hebrew Bible and the section on the Psalms. I recommend it to you. We'll get that in the show notes for you. You should totally buy it. It's a good Christmas gift. Which, by the way, that's coming up. And I actually did some translation of this, and I learned that translating a psalm is harder than translating like Paul, because you're supposed to make the poem make sense still. It's supposed to be a poem still. It's supposed to be a song still. And I'm going to read you the psalm in a second. It's short, don't worry. But there was a line that really moved me. In the Hebrew, it basically says, Lord our God, Yahweh Elohim. But the second line of the psalm says, how majestic your name in all the earth. And in the Hebrew, there's alliteration, which means that there's two words that start with the same letter. And the word for our God is, or the first one, Lord, is Adonai, and then the second one is Adir. And so Robert Alter said, hey, look, A-D-A-D in Adir and for majestic and Adonai for Lord alliterate. I want to preserve the alliteration. And so he said, Lord, our master, how majestic your name in all the earth. I didn't like master that much because it kind of relates to slavery, and that's where my mind went. So I said, why don't I say maker? That connects, and that like I can take that liberty here because we're doing poetry. We're not doing a direct translation. So like that was exciting for me to make a creative decision about how to interpret the psalm, and then even allow it to come into our moment too. So let me read you this Psalm 8, which is beautiful for St. Francis. Lord our Maker, how majestic your name in all the earth, whose splendor was told over the heavens. From the mouth of babes and sucklings you founded strength on account of your foes to put an end to enemy and avenger. When I see your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars you fixed firm, what is a human being that you should note them, and a mortal that you pay them heed, and you make them a little less than the gods, with glory and grandeur you crown them. You make them rule over the work of your hands. All things you set under their feet, sheep and oxen all together, and also the beasts of their field, birds of the heavens and fish of the sea, who moves on the paths of the sea. Lord, our Maker, how majestic your name in all the earth. That line envelops the psalm, same line as the beginning and the end. So there's your package for you. Go worship the earth, and take care of it too. That's. Sorry, I didn't say go worship God by taking care of the earth. I got to redo that whole thing because I can't have go worship the earth in there.
Worship with the earth.
That's what I want to say.
In Francis's song, he calls all of creation to sing with us, Alleluia.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's beautiful, Jonny. Thank you.
All right, well, I'm going to take us a totally different direction here. What was nourishing my soul this week were bad jokes. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Oh, you're going to do one?
Yes. Where does an 800-pound gorilla sleep?
Oh, I always want to know the answer.
Anywhere it wants. What? Oh, thank you for laughing. Okay, wait. Here's another one. What did one?
No, I'm sincerely amused.
What? I was sincerely laughing. I'll tell you why I was into these jokes, but I was sincerely laughing too. What do you do when a monster sneezes?
No.
Get out of the way.
Because it's a big sneeze.
Big sneeze. All right, last one. What did the chimney say to the little chimney? What did the big chimney say to the little chimney?
I don't know.
You smoke too much.
Okay. I like the first two.
All right. I should have stopped after the first two.
You nailed it on the first two.
So I guess what nourished my soul was laughter and playfulness with a child. Our friends Indiana and her father Iboro were over on Friday night, and my friend Maria, and we were hanging out, and I don't remember what got us started on jokes, but Indiana is 4, and I was teaching her how to tell a joke. And the first time she told one, there was like no rhythm. You know, it was just like a stream of words delivered. And I was like, no, come here. So we had to talk through like the pause. You wait for it. You let people think about an answer. And then by the time she kept practicing, every time I gave her a different joke, which all came from this stellar book called The Funniest Riddle Book Ever. That came from my childhood. I still have it on our shelf.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Every time she delivered one, she got better and better at it. And it was so funny. We were all enjoying her process of learning how to tell a joke and just being together. It reminded me how much I need this kind of spontaneous human interaction and relating. We didn't plan
Just
this whole
being
get together.
together. Yeah.
You know, it just happened on Friday night out of necessity, actually. And that really nurtured my soul. So I share that with you, and I'll put some more really good jokes in the show notes for you.
Wonderful.
Yeah, where do people find the show notes, guys?
You're on the podcast app that you have. If you open up the episode, you'll see them listed under. Usually you can expand and see them. You can also see them on our SoundCloud. And if you go to our website, circleofhope.church, we'll have a blog post with them on too.
Sweet.
Thanks again for listening to our show. Y'all are great. We love connecting with you. And write us back again. Resist and Restore podcast at circleofhope.net. We'll talk to you in a few weeks.